Simon Cowell's subtle changes after his son's heartbreaking diagnosis has left fans wondering what could shake the usually calm judge. The man who built an empire on tough love and harsh truths is now facing something that has turned his world upside down. A personal journey and emotional goodbye that has transformed him. What we discovered about Simon's heartbreaking situation will surprise you, revealing a side of Simon Cowell that few have ever seen. As one reporter put it, this changes everything. The beginning of everything. The beginning of everything. February 14th, 2014 changed Simon Cowell's life forever. It wasn't just another Valentine's Day. It was the day Eric Philip Cowell was born to the world. And with him came a transformation that nobody saw coming. Simon had always been the bachelor of the entertainment world. He was famous for saying he'd never have kids, claiming he was too old and too set in his ways. But when Eric arrived, everything shifted. The man who once lived only for his TV shows and record deals suddenly found himself thinking about someone else first. After I lost my parents, I genuinely felt I would never feel that kind of love for anyone ever again, Simon shared in a rare emotional moment. I thought that was it until I saw the scan of him for the first time. From that moment I saw the scan, I was like, that is it. I'm besotted. Eric wasn't just any celebrity baby. He was named after Simon's father, Eric Philip Cowell, carrying forward a family legacy that meant everything to the entertainment mogul. From the very beginning, Simon made it clear that Eric would be different. He wouldn't be spoiled like other celebrity children. He would learn the value of hard work. But as Eric grew older, Simon began noticing things that other parents might not see. Little moments that made him pause. These weren't necessarily concerning moments, but they were different enough to catch Simon's attention. The early years were filled with joy, but there were also questions. Eric was developing at his own pace, and Simon found himself becoming more protective than he'd ever imagined possible. He began toning down projects that would require him to be away from home for too long. He began scheduling his life around Eric's needs rather than his own career demands. What Simon didn't know was that these early observations would later become pieces of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that would eventually lead to the heartbreaking diagnosis that would shake his world to its core. A father's growing concerns. A father's growing concerns. As Eric grew from a toddler into a young child, Simon Cowell's protective instincts only intensified. But it wasn't just typical parental worry. There was something deeper happening. Simon began to notice something that made him question whether Eric's development was following the same path as that of other children his age. Eric had always been a quiet child, but as he approached his second birthday, Simon realized something significant. Eric still wasn't speaking. While other children his age were forming words and short sentences, Eric remained largely silent. Simon tried to convince himself that Eric was simply a late talker, but the worry always lingered beneath the surface. The entertainment industry is full of noise, bright lights, and constant stimulation. During public appearances, Eric would often cover his ears or seem overwhelmed by the chaos around him. Simon initially thought this was normal. After all, he was just a small child in a very adult world. But as these reactions continued, Simon began to wonder if there was more to it. Friends and family tried to reassure Simon that every child develops differently. Some children simply take longer to start speaking than others, they would say. But Simon's instincts told him something else was happening. He'd built his career on reading people, on understanding what made them tick. With Eric, he sensed there was a complexity he couldn't quite grasp. The sleepless nights began around this time. Simon would lie awake thinking about Eric's future, wondering if he was missing something important. He started researching child development, reading about different conditions and possibilities. The more he learned, the more questions he had. What made it even more difficult was Eric's intelligence. The boy was clearly bright, observant, and capable of understanding complex situations. He just expressed himself differently from other children. Simon began to realize that traditional milestones might not apply to his son. Eric was creating his own timeline, his own way of experiencing the world. Simon's concern wasn't about Eric being different. It was about making sure Eric had everything he needed to thrive. The father, who once measured success in record sales and TV ratings, now found himself measuring success in much smaller, more precious moments. A smile from Eric, a moment of connection, a breakthrough in communication. But even as Simon adapted to Eric's unique way of being, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading towards something bigger, something that would require more than just patience and love, something that would test everything he thought he knew about being a father. The world watches, the world watches. While Simon Cowell was privately grappling with his concerns about Eric's development, the public remained largely unaware of the internal struggle happening behind closed doors. To the outside world, Simon was still the sharp-tongued judge who could make or break careers with a single comment. But those close to him began noticing subtle changes in his behavior. Eric had made a few public appearances, including a memorable moment on Britain's Got Talent where he gave an act the golden buzzer. The audience loved seeing Simon's softer side, watching him interact with his son. But what they didn't see were the careful preparations that went into those moments. Simon had learned to create controlled environments where Eric could feel comfortable and safe. Soon, the media started picking up on Simon's transformation. Headlines would read about how fatherhood had changed the notorious bachelor. But they were missing the deeper story. Simon wasn't just becoming a gentler person. He was becoming an advocate for a child who experienced the world differently than most. Behind the scenes, Simon was making significant changes to his professional life. He started declining projects that would take him away from Eric for extended periods. He restructured his schedule to ensure he could be present for the important moments. His business partners initially thought this was just typical new parent behavior. But Simon's commitment to being available for Eric went deeper than anyone realized. The speculation about Eric's development began quietly in online forums and social media discussions. Some people noticed that Eric seemed different during his public appearances. Others commented on how protective Simon's speculation had become. But Simon refused to engage with the speculation. He understood that Eric's privacy was more important than satisfying public curiosity. What the public didn't know was that Simon was consulting with specialists, seeking answers to questions that kept him awake at night. He was learning about different developmental paths, exploring resources that could help Eric reach his full potential. Every consultation, every appointment, every conversation with an expert was another step toward understanding what his son needed. The irony wasn't lost on Simon. He'd spent his career judging others, deciding who was ready for the spotlight and who wasn't. Now he was learning that readiness looks different for everyone. Eric was teaching him that success couldn't be measured by traditional standards. Some of the most beautiful moments happened away from cameras in quiet spaces where Eric felt free to be himself. As the speculation continued to grow, Simon realized that he would eventually need to address the questions surrounding Eric's development. But he also knew that when that time came, it would be on his terms in a way that protected and honored his son. Signs, symptoms, and diagnosis. Symptoms and diagnosis. The turning point came during a family vacation when Eric was 4 years old. Simon had planned the perfect getaway, but what should have been a relaxing trip became a series of challenging moments that made it impossible to ignore what was happening with Eric's development. Eric had always been sensitive to changes in routine, but during this vacation, his reactions became more pronounced. New environments seemed to overwhelm him. The sounds of the resort, the unfamiliar food, the different bedtime routine, everything seemed to trigger responses that Simon had never seen before. One evening, while other families were enjoying dinner on the resort's terrace, Eric became visibly distressed by the combination of music, conversation, and clinking dishes. He began covering his ears and rocking back and forth. Simon tried to comfort him, but Eric seemed unreachable, lost in his own world of sensory overload. That night, Simon called his partner Lauren, and together they made a decision that would change everything. They would seek professional help, not because they thought something was wrong with Eric, but because they wanted to understand how to support him better. The official diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in December 2018. Simon Cowell sat in a small office across from a team of specialists who had been evaluating Eric for several months. The words autism spectrum disorder hung in the air like a weight that would forever change how Simon understood his son's future. The lead developmental pediatrician spoke gently but clearly. Eric shows significant characteristics consistent with autism spectrum disorder. His challenges with verbal communication, his sensory sensitivities, and his need for routine all point to this diagnosis. Simon felt his world shift in that moment. Not because the diagnosis was unexpected, he'd been preparing for this possibility for months, but because it made everything real. Eric would need specialized support, therapies, and an understanding that the world wasn't always ready to provide. What does this mean for his future? Simon asked, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it in public. The pediatric Ian smiled warmly. It means Eric will experience the world differently from other children, but with the right support, he can absolutely thrive. Many children with autism go on to live fulfilling, successful lives. The diagnostic report was comprehensive, detailing Eric's strengths alongside his challenges. While Eric struggled with verbal communication and social interaction, he showed remarkable abilities in pattern recognition and visual processing. The report noted his intense focus on subjects that interested him and his ability to remember complex sequences. Simon learned that Eric's autism was what professionals called moderate. He would need significant support in some areas, but he also had many capabilities that could be developed with proper intervention. The key was understanding how Eric's brain worked and adapting the world around him to meet his needs. The hardest part wasn't the diagnosis itself. It was thinking about how to tell the world. Simon had spent his career in the spotlight, but Eric's privacy was paramount. How do you protect a child from public scrutiny while also advocating for understanding and acceptance? That evening, Simon sat with Eric, watching him carefully arrange his toy cars in perfect lines. Eric's focus was intense, almost meditative. In that moment, Simon realized something profound. Eric wasn't broken or damaged. He was simply different. And that difference came with its own kind of beauty. The diagnosis also brought clarity to Simon's behavior over the past few years. His increased protectiveness, his schedule changes, his reluctance to put Eric in overwhelming situations. All of it made sense now. He'd been instinctively adapting to Eric's needs before he even understood what those needs were. But with the diagnosis came new responsibilities. Eric would need speech therapy, occupational therapy, and behavioral support. Simon would need to learn about autism, about advocacy, about creating a world where Eric could succeed. The entertainment mogul was about to become something else entirely. A father fighting for his son's future in a world that didn't always understand. Behind closed doors, after Eric's diagnosis, Simon Cowell's life transformed in ways that no one outside his inner circle could have imagined. The man who once thrived on chaos and unpredictability became a master of routine and structure with every day carefully planned to give Eric the stability he needed to thrive. Simon's Malibu home was redesigned with Eric's sensory needs in mind. Simon spared no expense in creating an environment where Eric could feel safe and comfortable. The daily routine became sacred. Eric needed predictability, so Simon structured his schedule around speech therapy sessions, occupational therapy appointments, and carefully planned social interactions. What looked like a simple play date required hours of preparation, ensuring Eric would be in the right mindset and environment to succeed. Simon also had to confront his own emotions about Eric's diagnosis. There were moments of grief, not for Eric, but for the typical father-son experiences he'd imagined. The spontaneous trips, the casual conversations, the effortless bonding moments. Instead, Simon learned to find joy in different types of connections. Eric's communication happened through gestures, expressions, and behavioral cues. Simon became fluent in this silent language, understanding when Eric was overwhelmed, when he was happy, and when he needed space. Their bond deepened through this unique form of communication, creating an intimacy that went beyond words. The therapy sessions were intensive and emotionally demanding. Simon watched Eric work with speech therapists, struggling to form words that came naturally to other children. He observed occupational therapy sessions where Eric learned to process sensory information without becoming overwhelmed. Each small breakthrough was celebrated like a major victory, but it was exhausting. Simon began toning down more projects, delegating responsibilities to trusted colleagues. His business partners noticed the changes, but didn't fully understand the reason behind them. Simon wasn't just becoming a more hands-on father. He was becoming Eric's primary advocate and support system. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Simon couldn't discuss Eric's challenges openly without risking his son's privacy. He felt alone in navigating this new reality, carrying the weight of decisions that would affect Eric's entire future. Every choice about therapy, schooling, and social interaction felt monumental. Late at night, Simon would sit in Eric's room watching his son sleep peacefully. In those quiet moments, he felt the full weight of responsibility. Eric was depending on him to create a world where he could succeed. The man who had built an empire on judging others now faced the ultimate test, being the father Eric needed him to be. The sadness wasn't for Eric's autism. It was for the world's inability to see Eric's unique gifts. Simon knew his son was extraordinary, but he also knew that not everyone would understand or appreciate Eric's different way of experiencing life. It's sad that the world might not be ready for someone as special as Eric. The public struggle. As 2019 progressed, Simon Cowell found himself facing an impossible dilemma. Rumors and speculation about Eric's development had begun circulating in celebrity gossip circles and online forums. The whispers were getting louder, and Simon knew he would eventually need to address them while protecting Eric's privacy. The speculation was painful to watch. People who had never met Eric were making assumptions about his development, his needs, and his future. Some comments were well-intentioned, but misguided. Others were cruel and based on outdated stereotypes about autism. Simon felt a fierce protectiveness that he'd never experienced before. People around Simon advised him to ignore the rumors, but his parental instincts told him something different. If he stayed silent, the speculation would continue and potentially become more harmful. But if he spoke out, he risked turning Eric's private struggle into public entertainment. The decision to speak publicly about Eric's autism came during a tough week. A tabloid had published photos of Eric having a sensory overload at a public event with commentary that completely misunderstood what was happening. Simon realized that silence was no longer protecting his son. It was allowing misinformation to spread. Simon's statement was carefully crafted and limited. He confirmed that Eric was autistic and asked for privacy and understanding. He emphasized that Eric was a happy, loved child who experienced the world differently than others. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Support poured in from other parents of autistic children, from autism advocates, from fans who appreciated Simon's honesty. But there was also the inevitable invasion of privacy that Simon had feared. Suddenly, every public appearance was scrutinized for signs of Eric's autism. Every interaction was analyzed and commented upon. The media attention was exactly what Simon had hoped to avoid. Eric's autism became a talking point, a human interest story, a teaching moment. While much of the coverage was positive and educational, Simon struggled with the loss of privacy. Eric hadn't chosen to be a public figure, but his father's celebrity status had made that choice for him. Simon began working with autism organizations, using his platform to educate people about the condition. He spoke about the importance of early intervention, the need for understanding and acceptance, and the gifts that often accompany autism. But he always kept the focus on general awareness rather than specific details about Eric's experience. The public struggle was exhausting. Simon found himself constantly defending Eric's right to privacy while also advocating for broader autism acceptance. He was learning to navigate a world where his son's medical diagnosis had become public knowledge and fair game for commentary. The saddest part for Simon was watching how some people responded to the news. Despite his efforts to educate and inform, some individuals continued to view Eric's autism as a tragedy or limitation. It's sad that even with all the information available, some people still couldn't see Eric's potential and worth. But there were also beautiful moments of connection and understanding. Parents reached out to share their own stories. Autism advocates thanked Simon for using his platform to increase awareness. Teachers and therapists expressed appreciation for his openness. In those moments, Simon felt that his decision to speak out had been worth the sacrifice of privacy. The heartbreaking goodbye. As the year went on, Simon Cowell faced a profound personal shift. He was not saying goodbye to his son, Eric, but he was saying goodbye to the person he thought he would be before autism changed everything. He was saying goodbye to the father he thought he would be. The father who would teach Eric how to ride a bike, have easy talks about school and friends, and watch his son reach all the typical milestones. That father was gone, replaced by someone who was more patient, more understanding, and more aware of the world's differences. Simon was also saying goodbye to his lack of understanding about autism and neurodiversity. He couldn't watch children struggle with communication or sensory issues without thinking about the support they needed. He couldn't enjoy talent shows the same way, knowing that some of the most talented people might never get a chance because the world wasn't set up for them. The goodbye also meant saying farewell to the simplicity of his life before. Every decision now had to consider Eric's needs, comfort, and future. Spontaneous trips were impossible. Public appearances had to be carefully planned. Simon was letting go of the freedom he once had. What hurt the most was saying goodbye to the dreams he had for Eric's future. Not because those dreams weren't possible. Eric was capable of amazing things. But because the path to those dreams would be harder, and Simon would need to learn how to support him in ways he hadn't expected. This change was visible to those who knew Simon best. He became quieter and more thoughtful, sometimes carrying a sadness he couldn't fully explain. The diagnosis had brought some relief because it gave him answers, but it also meant he had lost the typical father-son relationship he had imagined. His closest friends and family saw him mourn the conversations he might never have with Eric, the shared interest that might never form, and the usual childhood experiences Eric might never enjoy. It wasn't about loving Eric any less. It was about mourning the fatherhood that autism made impossible. The sadness was most obvious during milestones. Other parents celebrated their kids' first words, first days of school, and first friendships with simple joy. Simon celebrated those moments, too, but they came with more effort, extra support, and the knowledge that each milestone required much more work and advocacy than most people understood. However, in letting go of one version of fatherhood, Simon discovered something unexpected. The bond he was building with Eric was deeper, more meaningful, and more beautiful than he had imagined. Their connection went beyond words in the form of gestures, expressions, and a mutual understanding that didn't need to be spoken. This goodbye was sad, but also beautiful. Simon was letting go of his expectations and embracing the reality of fatherhood. He was becoming the father Eric truly needed. And in doing so, he realized that love could be stronger than any challenge and more meaningful than any traditional milestone. What do you think about Simon's journey as a father? Have you ever had to completely change your expectations about someone you love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.